Hey friends, so this is the last lesson for world history in 2020. And as I mentioned in my email, I am very much thinking about what's happening in our country right now and the police brutality and the Black Lives Matter movement. And so I'm seeing a lot of connections, and I hope you'll forgive me if I seem a little angry. But I want to see if I can make some of those connections for you. When we talked about the Cold War last week, we talked about it being a Cold War, meaning that there was no heavy fighting no hot fighting between the Soviet Union and the United States. Um, that didn't mean that there was no fighting. What happened was that the United States and the Soviet Union took their fight into other people's places and took their argument about how to run the world into trying to dominate the lives of Black and brown people all around the world, and the casualties were enormous. So that's the side of the Cold War that I want to focus on today. The reason why one of the reasons why this went down the way it did is that after World War II, uh, many countries that had been imperialized began to gain their independence. And so this process of decolonization, of colonies becoming independent of their imperial control, was happening all around the world. And you know that it started in India, and we watched a movie about that. But it spread from India and ended up affecting every other colony almost. And so all of these new countries were coming into their own, becoming their own nation, trying to think about what they wanted for themselves. And they were doing so in the middle of a war between the United States and the Soviet Union. And so instead of getting an opportunity to think about what they wanted and how they wanted to do it, almost all of them became uh, players in this struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union, and were forced by one or the other to make choices to match their alliances. So decolonization is a word that you might hear among activists in, say, the Black Lives Matter movement, and it's used there as a metaphor for the idea of getting free from your oppressor intellectually and socially and politically. And the metaphor to decolonization after World War II is intended. So the Cold War is this battle of power between the United States and the Soviet Union, and they each have a different idea about what the right way to be in the world is. With the United States taking the side of democracy and capitalism, as we talked about last time, and the Soviet Union taking the side of dictatorship and communism. But I think what you'll see really quickly is that this was actually really just an argument about capitalism versus communism, if that, and maybe really just a power struggle, because clearly both sides were willing to um, allow a government to be just as dictatorial as it needed to be, as long as it would go along with the economic interests of one another of these countries. So countries that became independent and then became allied with the United States, or became independent and then became allied with the Soviet Union, would be pressured to be either more capitalist or more communist. And just having any sort of idea about communism became an excuse for the United States to get on your case. But let me just give you some examples rather than elaborate on that. The first example of one of these, what they call proxy wars, a war between the United States and the Soviet Union that happens in somebody else's place and under the guise of some other argument, happened in Korea. Um, Korea was liberated from Japanese occupation at the end of World War II, and then occupied by the United States and the Soviet Union, with the United States taking the southern half and the Soviet Union taking the northern half. The idea was supposed to be that they were going to occupy, and then eventually the country would be independent. But because of the battle between the United States and the Soviet Union, neither occupier wanted to leave. Both set up separate governments with a communist dictatorship in the north and a supposedly capitalist dictatorship in the south. And in 1950, the communist government of North Korea, backed by the Chinese government that had just come into power in mainland China in 1949, and the Soviet Union invaded the southern half of Korea and almost succeeded in taking the entire peninsula. Um, in response to that, the United States asked the United Nations, the new international organization, to back an international military response to take back Korea. So let's just remember a few things about the UN briefly, because it's worth your time to review. We talked about how the United Nations is really controlled by 5 members of the standing members, the veto members of the Security Council. And that's the United States, the Soviet Union, China, France, and Britain. In 1950, China was represented by, not by mainland China, but by Taiwan, China and Taiwan. And that government was a partner of the United States. So China, in the form of Taiwan, France, Britain, and the United States all easily agreed to invade Korea and try to take it back. But the Soviet Union could have voted against that, but they were boycotting all meetings of the United Nations at that time. So the United Nations approved the occupation, and really just the United States military invaded Korea from the south and succeeded in pushing the communist government back almost into China. Then the governments of China and the Soviet Union responded by adding quite a bit of military power and pushed back the United States troops all the way back past the capital of South Korea, Seoul. And when it seemed in 1953 like the fighting was going to go on forever, both sides agreed to an armistice, a ceasefire, allowing this line, which still exists today, to become the demarcation between North and South Korea. So we are still technically in a state of war in South Korea, but there is an armistice, a no fighting agreement. Think a little bit about what it means for South Korea, or for Koreans in general, to be occupied and pushed back, first occupied by the Japanese, and then have this war that goes back and forth across their territory. People were invaded and re-invaded and pushed out and pushed out again. And somewhere between 2 and 3 million Koreans lost their lives in all of this fighting. So this was devastating for Korea. There was even talk of using nuclear weapons, which luckily did not happen. In Vietnam, a little bit south of China, after the war was over and the Japanese were pushed out, Vietnamese people got together and wrote a Declaration of Independence. And I think I've mentioned this to you before. It was written under the leadership of a man who was calling himself Ho Chi Minh. And if you read the text, you'll see that they were telling the world that they intended to create a democracy, and that they intended to achieve for themselves what the United States and France had achieved. This effort to convince us that the Vietnamese people only wanted what we had was not successful. The French tried to re-invade Vietnam and take it back. And when they couldn't do it in 1954, the United States invaded on their behalf, setting up a government in the south of Vietnam, which was beholden to the United States, and doing the bidding of the United States, and then doing battle against the government of Ho Chi Minh, which was in the north. And that battle involved a huge quantity of weaponry. We dropped more bombs in Vietnam and Cambodia than were dropped in the entire war of World War II. And the casualties were enormous. This famous picture shows young people who have been hit with chemical weapons, and so their skin is burning. That's why they have ripped off their clothes, and that's why they are screaming. Here you see United States soldiers standing over Vietnamese prisoners. And if these images remind you of some of the images of police brutality and the use of chemical weapons that we've seen from the police in the last couple of weeks, that's what they remind me of too. And so I think, what you see is this image of white people, the United States in this case, trying to dominate and control people of color, and doing it in the most humiliating and horrible of ways. That's what the Vietnam War is to me. Obviously, that's an opinion. The war lasted until 1976, when the United States gave up and left. And in other countries, it didn't play out so much as a war as it was the United States intervening in the affairs of the country. So a couple of examples from around the world, literally hundreds of examples exist from around the world of the United States or the Soviet Union intervening and trying to tell some government what to do. But I'm going to give you three examples, because you got to stick with some examples, right? In Iran, in 1953, there was an elected government under the leadership of Mohammad I think it's Mossadegh. Mohammad Mossadegh had the idea. He was very much against socialism, he said, but he had the idea that the government needed to control one industry and one business, and that business was the oil business. His idea, and many people were into this idea in Iran, was that if the government controlled the oil business in Iran, then the revenues from that oil business could be used to support schools and other important projects in their emerging economy. The problem with this idea, aside from the fact that controlling a business is sort of a socialist idea, but he only wanted to do it in one industry. But the big problem was that the oil business in Iran was controlled by the British. The company is called British Petroleum, and they owned all the oil rights in Iran, and so they did not want to lose them to the Iranian government. So the United States and Britain, in their intelligence agencies, worked together to effect a coup d'etat against the government of Iran and put back in power a monarch who, from Iran's older times, and this is the Shah, which you read about the eventual overthrow of the Shah in 1979 in the Iranian Revolution. And so the Shah took over from the government of Mossadegh in 1953, and then lost power in 1979 to an internal revolution. And that's the revolution that you read about in the book Persepolis. So I just wanted to remind you of that with this page from that wonderful book. So hopefully that's making some connections for you. But that's the United States trying to tell Iran how they should do their business, and putting a dictator in place who was later rejected by his people. Another example in Guatemala, so going all the way across the other side of the world. In Guatemala in 1954, there was an elected government, very popular elected government led by a man named Jacobo Arbenz. And similarly, Arbenz had very little interest in being involved with the Soviet Union and did not think of himself as a socialist or a communist. But he did have the idea that the land in Guatemala should be redistributed from the wealthy to the poor. And in Guatemala, what that really meant was that most of the land in Guatemala was controlled by one company out of the United States, called United Fruit. And they sell bananas under the label Chiquita Banana. So think about them when you buy bananas. United Fruit controlled all of the railways, all of the ports, and most of the land in Guatemala. So if Arbenz was going to take any land and give it to the poor, he would be taking it from United Fruit. The United States government decided it was important to support United Fruit, and they sent the CIA in to effect a coup d'etat that took Jacobo Arbenz out of power and led to a long civil war in Guatemala. And many, many people who are with us in the United States today left Guatemala because of that civil war. And of course, I've already told you the story of what happened in the Congo, but I'll remind you that the Congo became independent of Belgium in 1961 and had an elected government under the leadership of Patrice Lumumba. Lumumba was a socialist, had a lot of ideas about socialism, and was also very popular and very much elected in a democracy. Um, but the United States felt that his leadership was dangerous, and in particular was concerned about losing control of uranium mines in the Congo. And so the CIA intervened. And so here's your example of how uh, the racism and domination of people of color around the world by whites and is always worse for Black Africans, in the same way that things happen in the United States, that anti-Black racism is often the most violent and most vicious that we see. So in the Congo, um, the leader was assassinated by the CIA. The other previous two leaders that I mentioned to you were jailed or exiled, but Patrice Lumumba paid with his life. And Congo came to be controlled by a United States selected dictator, Mobutu Sese Seko, who led a regime that stole a lot of money from the Congo and hurt and killed a lot of people. In 1959, there was a revolution in Cuba, resulting in the only socialist nation in the Western Hemisphere. And I'm going to skip tons and tons of stories here, but Fidel Castro, the leader of the Cuban Revolution, was not exactly interested in being aligned with the Soviet Union, but he didn't really have a choice because he immediately became the enemy of the United States. And if he was going to get any kind of support or protection, it would come only from the Soviet Union. In fact, in 1961, the United States tried to overthrow the Cuban government in an invasion called the Bay of Pigs invasion. And this is kind of similar to what recently we tried to do in Venezuela. Some folks who weren't really part of the United States government, with United States government tacit support, went over to Cuba and tried to invade and take over, and they were unsuccessful, and they were arrested. This is a scene of them on the beach in Cuba being arrested by the Cuban Revolutionary Government. So, unable to overthrow the Cuban government, we were kind of considering our options as a country when the Soviet Union agreed to help Castro by providing nuclear weapons. All kinds of things you could think about what was going on here from the Soviet Union's point of view, but the point is that the Soviet Union began to ship nuclear weapons to Cuba, and that would have meant that there would be nuclear weapons pointed at the United States just 99 miles off the border from Florida. So that was going to break the mutually assured destruction agreement by making us more vulnerable to the Soviet Union than the Soviet Union was to us. And so the United States threatened to launch nuclear missiles against the Soviet Union before those missiles could be fully delivered into Cuba. And for 3 days, the world thought, a lot of people in the world thought that things were about to end forever. In a giant nuclear exchange between the United States and the Soviet Union. But in the end, the Soviet Union agreed to remove their missiles from Cuba. And what Cuba got was not missiles to protect them, but a kind of tacit deal between the United States and the Soviet Union that the United States would at least pretend to leave Cuba alone. So we've tried numerous times to overthrow their government, but mostly we just leave them alone and don't trade with them. That has its own story. So another example from the Central America. Possibly you could think of this as a more positive story. There were many nations that were becoming independent that tried to avoid dealing with either the Soviet Union or the United States. They called themselves non-aligned. And they also used a word, third world. So they would say that the United States was the first world and their allies. The Soviet Union was the second world, and their allies. And they were going to try to form a third world, a place that was unaligned, a group of nations that were trying not to be communist or capitalist, but to try something in between, something unique and special to their circumstances. Um, this organization of non-aligned or third world countries was formed in part by Jawaharlal Nehru, who you remember from the movie about Gandhi, the man who became the first prime minister of India, along with the prime minister of Indonesia and several prime ministers from Africa, and even a few folks from Europe. You'll notice Yugoslavia on this map. So the word third world was originally a point of pride from these countries who were trying to chart their own path and create a plan for nations of color that was not part of the vision of the Cold War. But because many of those nations were developing economies, it became a stereotype. And now when people say third world, they mean poor. And that is not what was originally intended. So in their logo today, these folks tend to emphasize the word non-aligned instead of the word third world. The last thing I wanted to mention is Afghanistan, because this affects us today. So, what we see, the pattern that I'm trying to show you is one of the United States and to a lesser extent the Soviet Union trying to police the decisions that are made by Black and brown people around the world, irrespective of the amount of violence that instigates. So Afghanistan is a place where we're still at war. So I wanted to just explain sort of how that all came to be for a second. Afghanistan was one of those non-aligned nations, and in 1973, the government of Afghanistan, which isn't never really been a hugely strong government because Afghanistan doesn't really hang together as a country. It's really very diverse ethnically, and most of the different ethnic groups in Afghanistan have their own internal structure of government for their community. So that centralized government in Afghanistan's never really worked. But in 1973, there was a central government in Afghanistan, and it was thrown over by a communist group from inside the country. And for a few years after that coup d'etat, Afghanistan was run by a group of Afghani communists. They were supported by the Soviet Union and came to be aligned with the Soviet Union. And when the communist government couldn't hold it together and lost all its popularity in Afghanistan, the Soviets invaded to try to prop it up. So in 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan militarily and tried to control the country. They were never successful. Afghanistan is mountainous. The people of Afghanistan were hugely against the Soviet occupation, but also the United States and Europe tried to take Afghanistan back from the Soviets by supporting revolutionary groups within Afghanistan. One of the revolutionary groups within Afghanistan that the United States gave weapons and money to try to fight the Soviets was called the Taliban. And the Taliban is a small group of folks who have a very strong ideas about an all-Muslim traditional government and kind of functions as a gang. But we gave them money because they were against the Soviets. And then having given them money, when the Soviets left in 1989, that group became very powerful. There was a long period of almost 7 years of war between the various groups in Afghanistan. And in 1996, the Taliban formed a sort of a centralized government. And they were running Afghanistan in 2001. So one of the folks that had come to Afghanistan to help fight the Soviet Union was a group of folks from Saudi Arabia, including the man who was responsible for thinking of the attack on the Twin Towers in New York City. And so when that attack happened in the United States turned to the Taliban government and said, "We demand that you give up these folks who are responsible for terrorism in the United States. And the Taliban government refused, and the United States invaded. Now, we might have known that if the Soviets couldn't control Afghanistan, we wouldn't be able to control it either. And so there we are in Afghanistan now. It's been 19 years, and we're still fighting in Afghanistan. And this is all the follow-up and the long-term effects of Cold War interventions on the part of both countries in Afghanistan's affairs. So, just some thoughts about the parallel, the way that people of color in this country are policed and dominated by our government and in the most violent way. So have people of color around the world. And when we're fighting for Black Lives to Matter, and to me, that includes a vision of a world in which people get to make their own decisions and run their own countries. And they are not dominated by countries like the United States. So I've included an article about what's going on right now in Afghanistan if you're interested. But maybe you would like to share with me a story that you know about the Cold War, or something that stuck out to you from this video, or maybe as you've been thinking about the Black Lives Matter movement and police brutality, you have other thoughts that you'd like to share with me. And it's also really possible that you're just exhausted right now and focused on other classes. So please don't hurt yourself. I'm going to pass my class. Don't worry about it. I always look forward to your thoughts, and the things that you write to me mean a lot. So thank you very much.